the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is the murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we get started with our guest today, I do want to throw out that Taylor and I have a Patreon at www.patreon.com/MUHH. Definitely consider throwing us a buck to help support the show. We appreciate everyone who does. We have a very, very exciting episode that we're bringing to you today. We have both Todd McGowan and Ryan Engley of the Why Theory podcast joining us. We're going to do a little focus on, I guess, psychoanalysis and capitalism, broadly speaking, with Todd's book, Capitalism and Desire, being kind of the primary text that we'll look at. But, we'll bring in some different things, some different perspectives, as we typically do. But I kind of feel like for this episode, when you were a kid, did any of you ever, take a jar and open it up and throw in maybe some ants and a spider and a cricket and a grasshopper? That's kind of how I feel on my end today with this episode. So,
do you know that Mitch Hedberg joke?
I don't know.
Smacky the Frog.
No, I don't know that.
Because you get a frog, you put it in a jar and a twig to simulate the environment that it's used to, and that's what kids do. Like there's no problem. Anyway.
Gosh, he's been dead for so long, sadly, and I don't think I really watched much after he passed. So all of this is like distant, early kind of childhood memory of his stand-up. I couldn't tell a Mitch Hedberg joke off the top of my head, but like that vibe is still with me, My
friend saw him live shortly before. I guess it would have been shortly before he died, and they only had time to ask one question. And my friend asked him, "How do you get your hair to look like that?" and he just said, "Whatever they have at the hotel, I just put in there." That's what he said. So anyway,
Chad moment.
Yeah.
Does she regret that was the last question, or is there something cute about it? Yeah.
No, that was her favorite. No, that's a lasting memory. For sure.
That's good. I have fond memories of Bill Hicks as well. He's another kind of comedian I put in that vein who died too early. I still regularly watch his stuff. So I don't have the same like psychic hang up, I guess.
Well, we're the jar for you, Cooper.
Yes.
I know, right?
We're all Smacky the Frog here.
Exactly. Before we get started, and I mentioned this, earlier, but I want this to be on the record. I'm just so thankful to both of you. You've been extremely generous with your time and boosting the show and helping out and coming on and being super generous. So, I just want to thank you both from the very sincere bottom of my heart for, I don't think that the podcast would be where it is today. And like, I might not be doing this with Taylor, who's amazing in his own right, without both of your help. So I just want to thank you both, and Taylor for that matter, for joining me, just, some random guy on the internet. So,
well, if that's true, I also have to thank both of you, and I'm really happy to make your acquaintance, because if you're one of the reasons that got me and Coop together, then many thanks. Can't even put it into words.
Wham wazzle. Thank you so much.
It's pretty funny too, because when Todd first came on the first time, we got to talking about how he left Texas State a year before I went there, and the teacher that replaced him was a very influential person that got me into Foucault and Derrida, but never psychoanalysis. And
of
so
course not, right?
That's an interesting little like missed chance, or my whole intellectual trajectory could have been completely different. So
if I'd have just stuck around.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
It might be fun today to start out with at least three of us in this podcast today are at least moderate to super fans of Lacan, and I don't know where Taylor would place himself, but
I'm definitely a student. I've been like crash reading lots of Lacan lately. I'm doing research reading the seminars, the Acree when he cites it, although that is a painful experience. I'm sure everyone, has.
He's not a good writer. Todd and I are locked up on that one.
He's doing something performative, right? If I'm being charitable, when I like on a good day, I'm like, yeah, Lacan's wanting us to like work through. Mm-hmm. But other times, I agree with you. It's like it's like pulling teeth, But I would say I'm a fan of Lacan. I mean, I feel like again, I have so much to learn. There's still seminars coming out, and there's a lot of material to cover. But I do appreciate his work, especially more so this year, having spent dozens and dozens of hours reading. So yeah, I definitely feel that way. And I know you still have that namesake, your Twitter handle.
That's right.
Do they know that your Twitter handles?
I don't think either of them are are active on Twitter, at least. So
yeah, no, mine's the thing with, as I say this everywhere, is mine exists so that another guy with my name can't have at Ryan Engley. And it's
the barrier to desire, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, but it's just so like, he seemed like a nice person, but he wanted to switch. On Twitter, and that was the last time that I ever tweeted, and that was I think in 2013 or something like that. And to me, it just seems like there's no way he thinks that. I'm certain he doesn't think this, but it's so, I guess, so much more enjoyment in not tweeting and having the handle than if I used it, because I'm sure like every once in a while this guy probably like, why do I have to have the underscore? With the guy who doesn't use it, he just gets the name all like it's official, but I have to have the underscore and I'm the one that uses it. So I get a lot more enjoyment at Twitter and not using it.
That's great.
That's a very right-wing form of enjoyment that you
Oh, calling him out. That's funny.
Et tu, Brute. That's all right.
I just figured, if I had your name, I would, and it was taken, I would do one of those workarounds like real.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Like, or the Ryan Engley. You see these kind of ways of some of the check marks, how they work around not having that handle.
I would rather be the symbolic Ryan Engley, I think.
There you go.
That would, well, yeah, we'll see. We'll see if that has to happen at some point in the future. Probably not.
With that fandom for Lacan in mind, and I think at least for Taylor and I, our fandom of Guattari is that in the anti-Oedipus papers and in some other places, there's some very compelling and interesting. I don't know. For me, I find the sort of drama surrounding those two to be just absolutely, I'm just fascinated by it. And all these little notes, and in the anti-Oedipus papers in particular, Guattari is just giving this insight to this sort of enigmatic figure of Lacan in quotes, So what I did is I gathered a few pretty interesting and I think I even have a kind of spicy, fiery polemic from Guattari, but I wanted to share those, and I thought that might be a good place for us to kind of get things rolling before we I think in terms of the actual meat of the conversation, I wanted to start out with Death Drive and Freud and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, kind of work there a little bit. But I thought that these kind of opening quotes would maybe move us in that direction and be fun. So this is from Guattari, and I believe this is from, Soft Subversion. So I'm just going to read this. I was a student at the Sorbonne. I was bored shitless in courses with Lagache, Sarzeau, I don't remember who, and then I went to Lacan's seminar. I have to say that it represented an entirely unforeseen richness and inventiveness in the university. That's what Lacan was. He was above all a guy with guts. You can say all you want about Lacan, but you can't say the contrary. He had no lack of guts. He possessed a depth of freedom that he inherited from a rather blessed period. I have to say, the period before the war, the period of surrealism, a period with a kind of gratuitous violence. One thinks of Guide's Lafcadio. He had a Dadaist humor, a violence at the same time, a cruelty. He was a very cruel guy, Lacan, very harsh. To me, this stuff is just absolutely fascinating and gives you just this totally different, I think, perspective on Lacan as a person. So I don't know if you guys have been exposed to any of these quotes or have any exposure to the anti-Oedipus papers or anything like that, but I just thought this might be a fun way to kind of start the episode.
Doesn't it show how unlikable he was?
I
find him, I've, as you said, I'm indebted to him in many ways, but I find him so unlike Freud, and who I think is incredibly very likable. I think Lacan is very unlikable. Mm-hmm. So I think this just, the fact that Guattari was fascinated by his cruelty, that just, I don't know. I don't find cruelty fascinating. And I think he was perverse. I think when Taylor was talking about the writing, like, I think that the fact that the writing is basically unreadable is just a sign of this perverse acting out. And I think that this statement from the Oedipus Papers is just another sign of that. I think that I have to say, I don't find anything charming about this statement.
You and I have talked about this before. I don't know if it's made it on the show, but just personally, I think it's because he was, if you really believe in, if you just at a base level, at a fundamental level, if you really believe in what psychoanalysis has to say, which is that which is most you is that which would just escape you. You'd have no purchase or control over it. In Lacan's term, it would be extimate to you. If you really, really believe that, then you're invited by Lacan's perversion to see that it's because he was an asshole, because he was perverse. That's why the theory exists in a way that's bigger than him. It's not reducible to him as a person, which is good because he was, I don't know, friends with Francisco Franco and kind of sucked a lot of the time. So it's good that it's not reducible to him as a person. But I don't know, I could maybe see, you can see maybe that tension in what Guattari is saying. A guy with guts. He had no lack of guts, also fantastically cruel. But, yeah.
I mean, I like what you're saying there, Ryan, but don't you think even like guts seems like the wrong word? Because think about, like, at the time, I would say Jean-Paul Sartre, there's a guy with gut. He like marched with the students. He didn't go in and like condemn the students.
It's true. Like Lacan did. Yeah.
Like, so I feel like
that's probably what he thought was gutsy, though. I think for Guattari, I think, which you and I both agreed that like Lacan was, even though he famously says, right, like, you want a master and you're going to get one. He ends up being right, but it's not a revolutionary position that he takes up.
See, my read on this quote was more so not that Guattari was particularly interested in his cruelty, just that I think he was interested in what Lacan was doing theoretically was more so. I mean, that's why I like Lacan as well, is just the theoretical. I mean, I like structural linguistics. That stuff is fun for me. I enjoy that. I enjoy that kind of perspective and like playing with those. So I think that's more so what he was going for. And then just kind of giving some insight into Lacan's own sort of whatever circumstances. He had sort of a unique circumstance in terms of growing up in that kind of Dadaist period. And I think he always had that. There's another quote. I mean, he, like he says here, he's got that Dadaist humor. And I think absolutely that comes through in his love of puns and the like. So
yeah, but isn't that? I'm sorry to be. I hate.
Oh no, go ahead.
I hate people that are contrarian, and now I'm going to do it. So, but isn't that really the worst part of him? All the puns, all the ridiculous invented words, all that stuff. We could really do without that. And what he doesn't say is there was this period before the war, where he was a really close friend and student of Alexander Koshev. And that's why he was able to have the insights that he does. So also from Sartre as well. So I don't know, like it's, and he's an incredible reader of Freud. Once you, this is one thing I would say, once you read Lacan's reading of Freud, it's very hard not to see that and to think, oh, Freud really was saying that, which is, I think, really a tribute to him as a reader, just as purely as a reader. So I guess for me, like, it kind of misses, again, I'm sorry to say this because I really hate contrarians. I think it, like, the Dadaist humor, I just don't think that's what it was really that gets him to his the theoretical insights that he had.
I don't think you're being contrarian. This is absolutely consistent. The Lacan that you don't like, I mean, we're, like we say this on the show, the Lacan that we don't like is the one that finds new ways to install himself as master. And some of the ways that is expressed is through just being perverse, deliberately beguiling, this like wordplay that one of my favorite, it's a little bit like one of my favorite television cliches is characters in a show where there's some sort of central mystery. They find something and they're like, what is it? And someone says, could be nothing, could be everything. And it's like, and Lacan does that a little bit too much.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because it's a total contrast with Slavoj, right? Slavoj never has told a pun, zero invented words, right? So I feel like that's an interesting.
He tells a lot of jokes.
He tells a lot of jokes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
the joke structure that expresses something, I think, for Slavoj.
But also, I mean, Lacan doesn't joke. I don't know a single Freud jokes. I don't know a single joke that. So it's funny. This Dada sense of humor doesn't manifest itself in him telling any jokes. I find really funny.
I read it kind of the way in which, like the clown or the fool or the Joker figure or the rogue even kind of
I think the rogue
is able to work in like narrative forms and ways of making the private erupt in the public and sort of shifting the czar and the king and sort of tumbling it. So Lacan does both, right? He does take on that master's discourse, but many times it's to subvert it. And whether or not he succeeds, and it's true, his writing is way more convoluted and way more painful, as I said, psychically. But his seminars, there are times when he does approach, again, that esotericism, especially towards the later years. But as you said, as a reader of Freud, I mean, I think that you're right. And that's something that's left out here. Guattari did really admire Lacan for staying true to a certain reading of Freud that did buck the established notions of the time, right? With objects relations, with the Anna-Freud's ego psychology and this kind of thing. So without that, Todd, without what you were talking about, without his sort of showing himself as an exemplary reader of Freud transformatively, I don't think that the humor would make up for it that Guattari sees.
Right. I like what you're saying there, because it's an interesting, it's so different than most thinkers, like that the written work is the esoteric work and the seminars are actually the exoteric, right? Like even though he meant it the opposite, right? He meant the seminars as for a little group.
Yes.
They're actually what's exoteric, what's available to the wider public, which is why, I don't know if you know this, it just got translated, this book by Jacques Miller. It got translated as A Search for Clarity, but it's called a L'Oeuvre Claire de Lacan. And what's interesting about it is that he says you can understand Lacan solely from the writing. I want to say, no, you can understand him only if you throw all the writing out and only come to it just kind of in the way you said, Taylor, just to confirm certain ideas, whatever. But I think the seminars are pretty clear, actually. They're pretty, you kind of make your way through them.
Right. Yeah, we did a full episode on Seminar 3, and I didn't find it. It was, I guess, the first seminar I read fully, and I didn't have too much trouble with it.
The earlier seminars do feel a little bit easier, but, Todd, one that you use that's so important, and that was the first translated, right? Seminar 11, that's a fairly clear one too, even though that's kind of middle of his, like the later ones are difficult because you do see a lot of the not work going on. You also see the work in Encore. I mean, I do feel like that's a difficult one, and he seems to play around a little bit more, kind of like in his writing than some of the earlier seminars. But one thing I had never thought of is that Zizek never puns. My gut trusts you. Something I would have to confirm and wonder about. Not even one, not one pun.
Never.
Oh man,
never. No.
That's
not even the familiar, right? Like Freud. Like Freud loves that.
I mean, he might have referenced that, but he's talking about someone else, right? He's not making
right. Yes, right.
I am known as a prolific punner on Twitter. Just to throw that in, neither here nor there. This next quote. So this is going to be from Guattari's journal from August 24th of 71. And I'm reminded a little bit, I think you both brought this up on Why Theory when you did the 3 episodes on Deleuze and Guattari about sort of this Oedipal thing between this kind of the irony of anti-Oedipus and this sort of Oedipal relationship to Lacan. So I want to read this little excerpt from Guattari's journal. Another dream about Lacan. This is insane. I can hear them from here saying, badly eliminated transfer, etc. In a sense, it's true. If transfer is Oedipal reterritorialization artificially woven onto the space of the couch, I have Oedipal rot sticking to my skin, not passively, but with all the will to power of the death drive. The more I become disengaged, the more I try to become disengaged. From 20 years of Lacano-Labordian comfort, the more this familialist carcass enfolds me secretly. I would rather admit anything else.
I am sad that they translated the French wrong in terms of transference.
Right. It's just a mistake.
It's just a mistake. You're right. It's just a mistake.
Yeah, you're right. That's it. Because the word means both things. So
right.
The word is just transfer.
Yeah. French,
you're exactly right, Taylor, that they just because it should be translated as transference. I think this is a really interesting one. And I think it is I think it is right to say that. I mean, it's interesting because this is a point where I think Guattari stays close to what Lacan thinks about that transference is something that has to be, you have to overcome it in a certain way. And I think I think Lacan thinks it's more necessary than Guattari would think. And I don't know that he would equate it with reterritorialization. I mean, I know he wouldn't, but I think the same kind of trajectory is still present there. I mean, I think that's maybe what's interesting to me about the project of Deleuze and Guattari is that in a way it's the same trajectory as that of Lacan and psychoanalysis, right. But the terms and the structure within the trajectory is I think fundamentally different.
It's interesting that we see in Soft Subversions and in these journal entries and in some of the other writings of the anti-Oedipus papers that some of the polemic for Lacan doesn't make its way into the full work of anti-Oedipus. I mean, there are points theoretically where they seem to diverge, but it's not as, it feels like a little like blaming the students to save the father, to save Lacan. Like, so blaming Leclerc, blaming Manoni, blaming some of these other quote unquote Lacanians, if they would even call themselves that, and trying to save at least Lacan somewhat, like he's being either misinterpreted or misused.
Even Freud, I think, right? Even Freud gets kind of a pass in that book.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And I think part of it is the way in which both Freud and Lacan were so important for Deleuze in difference and repetition, right? So I think he thinks it would be schizophrenic in a bad way to like totally turn on them only like 5 years later. So maybe not even. So I think that's part of it. But I think you're right that there's a real kind of protecting of those paternal figures. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think we said this on that episode, is very interested in going at actual analysts, named Taylor, as you just said, naming the abusers of the theory, basically the people who, I think I called it, the people who make psychoanalysis out to be like a fascism of the unconscious or something like that. That's the target. And I just keep thinking 5 minutes ago, you described, and I think this makes sense, that like you described Guattari as thinking Lacan as roguish. And I think that's really nice because I think Lacan wants to think that he's Han Solo, but he's probably Darth Vader. And I think and I think that's what makes him interesting, yes. Or what makes the thought interesting. So that.
Yeah,
at least he's not the emperor.
I know.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
or Grand Moff Tarkin. I mean, I thought that's what you were going to say. No, but
moments of triumph, overrate the chances.
Oh man,
I think it's in it. When I wonder what you two would say about this. That I think that the real crux of the point of rupture for them, for Guattari and for Deleuze too, is that of representation, right? So yeah. I think that, for psychoanalysis, representation is necessary.
Yes.
And I mean, it's not necessarily the end point because Lacan's concerned with what escapes representation, but it's nonetheless necessary to have, you have to have representation to have what escapes it. But I think for both Deleuze and Guattari, the very representation itself is the problem because it's so like it's enmeshed with negation. And I think, the allergy that both of them have to negation. I mean, I think that's what brought them together, that they're in this French space where negation, because of Sartre especially, but also because of Lacan, it's so privileged. And then they're going to turn this other way. So I don't know. To me, that's really everything else is, I think, secondary to the way that representation figures for Lacan and then doesn't figure for them, or figures only negatively, even though they're not negative. It figures only negatively for them.
I think you're totally right. You could see it. You can either talk about it in terms of Deleuze trying to, 68, 69, he writes the What is Structuralism essay that sometimes gets forgotten, but that Lacan, features prominently. And so it is this question of whether it's the beginnings of post-structuralism, whatever you want to say. But yeah, this railing against representation or the ways of theorizing it, specifically with whether it be the image of thought or whether it be really, I see it as this question of yeah, I mean, you put it as a negation and they want to make it all positive on the body without organs, et cetera. It's hard to see though, someone like Guattari who does stay close to Freud, this working through even like an essay, Freud's essay, Light Negation, which does come after that period we were talking about earlier with Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It is a sticky issue because it seems, I'm not sure where Guattari would necessarily fit in with Deleuze on that issue off the top of my head, because it does seem like Deleuze's pet project, right? You brought up difference of repetition. So Guattari needing that too is food for thought and something that I would love to take further time later to discuss it or to think about it, because I honestly don't know.
I think logic of sense is, I'm going to always bring it back to seriality because I think it's been underworked. To me, a really big point for Deleuze where he starts to, I think at like where the future kernel will develop is he takes, as opposed to Derrida, he takes what Lacan says about the series very seriously. And he takes what Lacan works through in the Purloin Letter seminar, like he takes it as read, that signification emerges from chance. You may think there is chance, but there's actually order in it. I think he completely takes that seriously. And I think he's a little scandalized by it. And we have to think of a way out. There needs to be a way out. And that's what leads him to, discuss like the phantasm. And he wants to interject novelty into something that would otherwise be seen as a ceaseless repetition of the same. And I think it's in that sense where you get the idea that the symbolic is a trap. That becomes very operative for Deleuze. I think it becomes really operative for him and Guattari when they get together and they work on that problem. And I think and for Lacan, it doesn't function that way. And it's as Todd was saying, part of it is how you work through and think about negation and what do you do with the limit. And so in Lacan, the idea of the limit, that is what is of necessity the thing that would exceed it. Whereas Deleuze sees the limit that Lacan lays out, and there's got to be another way. So there's a way to abscond to some non-space. This ends up being like a whole thread. Taylor, I know that you've translated La Ruelle. That's like his whole thing. Alexander Galloway, like that's like who, sort of my field broadly speaking, are really interested in these things. And there's a deadlock in the symbolic. And I think that's what brings a lot of these people together. And what do you do with that deadlock? How do you understand that? And then that ends up being the little split away.
Well, don't you think too that part of the relation between Deleuze and Lacan is that Lacan wanted Deleuze to be Jacques-Alain Miller before Jacques-Alain became Jacques-Alain Miller, and I think that would have rubbed me the wrong way. I think that rubbed Deleuze the wrong way.
You mean Guattari, right?
Sorry. No. I mean Deleuze. Like, okay. He wanted Deleuze to be his philosopher. I see. Gotcha. The person that, it's interesting that he didn't live to see Slavoj, because I think Slavoj really is the person who turned Lacan into a philosophy. And I don't think he would have liked it, but just because it's way too Hegelian for him, he would have seen that as a real betrayal. But I think that there was something kind of personal almost between, certainly Guattari is talking here in what Cooper read about the transferential relation, but there's also for Deleuze this, I think this recoil from, I'm not just going to be somebody's spokesperson, right. I'm not going to turn my life into being your court philosopher. It's interesting. I don't know if you, for anyone who's read Seminar 11, so Jacques-Alain Miller was 19 years old and he's in that seminar asking these amazing, it's amazing really. How far he's fallen from that is bad, I think. But
shots fired.
Yeah, I don't know. The shot's so below the target. He won't fired. But I think what's interesting is like, it's hard. I can't imagine, and I think it'd be hard for most people to imagine dedicating your life to someone else's thought in that way. So I think Deleuze recoiled from that, but Miller didn't. Like, he was fine with that, and it's clear he enjoys. Taylor was talking about the in a certain sense, the slow pace with which the seminars are released. Yeah. I think that's Miller's enjoyment, right?
Yes.
Like he gets to he's holding back by not letting, somebody told me, it must've been over 12 years ago, something. he wrote this person an email saying, I finished all the seminars. They're all edited. And like one has come out since then. So it's really, to me, that's interesting in the dynamic of Deleuze and Lacan, that Deleuze just wouldn't allow himself to be put in that position. And I think rightly, like, I think that's not a good position to be in. I think it had a deleterious effect on Molaire.
He married into the family, right?
Well, that's right. That's a whole other thing.
So, and it's interesting to think about the previous quote from Guattari about the cruelty, because didn't Molaire's kind of controversial essay, what was released at the end of May, doesn't he basically confirm this, that Lacan was an asshole?
Brutal to him, right? Like, brutal to him.
Son-in-law. So I don't know if that's a weird transferential relation that he sought out, or, it's also this weird thing where you can be harshest to the ones you love because you know that they'll forgive you, something like that, right? But I'm not. Who knows about Lacan and love, right? Besides some of the other biographical niceties we know about Bataille and stuff like that. Right. I think that it's interesting about Molaire's pace. You're totally right and it goes back to what you say in your book about this, this, what was it? Boundaries without barriers, or am I saying it in the opposite way?
I think it's barriers without boundaries, but right.
But the sort of that dialectic of the constitutive failure and him finding this weird enjoyment in that and keeping us with bated breath, or like keeping us on the edge of our seats and wanting more.
Right. I mean, it's why people pay attention to that crazy essay that he wrote on trans, right? If he wasn't the publisher of Lacan's oeuvre, like no one would care.
No one would care. You're right.
And so I wrote to a friend of mine in France after that statement came out. And I said, what about the statement by Molaire? And he writes me like, you guys, he's like, Milner said something on trans, and I'm like, no, Miller. He wrote me back. He's like, je m'en fous. Like like no one cares. So like it didn't even. It's funny. It made more of an impact in America than it did in France, because people just know he's going to say just things that are crazy.
That's interesting. Just to go back to. We did an episode, Taylor translated Machinic Unconscious from Guattari as well. So we did a series on that. And in one aspect, it's whenever there's a chapter or two, I guess the last half of the book, rather, Guattari focuses on Proust. And so as part of that, we read Proust and Signs from Deleuze as a supplemental reading. And it was, not only was I thought it was amazing writing. Just an amazing some beautiful writing from Deleuze, but within that, he sounded very Lacanian, or at least was very influenced by structural linguistics at that point. And I made that comment during that episode. So I don't know, I just wanted to throw that out there. Not only that is present within Deleuze in that period, but also just that I think Proust and Signs is just an amazingly written work that I absolutely loved reading. So.
Cooper, I agree with you. Do you think that, I think that changes though, don't you? Like that changes over the course of his.
Oh, absolutely. Proust and Signs, I believe, was published, Taylor, you would probably know best.
I know the revised date is 72, and he adds some stuff that is very inspired by his conversations with Guattari. And I think that's, I don't remember the original publication date. It was sometime. It
was like 65. I want to say it was as early as 65. So this is pre-Deleuze, pre-Guattari.
Yeah, so he revises and he updates it and adds a little section at the end in 72, which uses some language that we find in Anti-Oedipus and the papers. I was still reflecting on the negation thing. I think the one place I would go would be Guattari's essay Machine and Structure, which I think is both influenced by Deleuze and influences him. It's before their meeting, but it has, this goes to Ryan's point about seriality. It has a lot of that language that vibes well with Logic of Sense and the work on that. And so if Guattari is locating negation in the field of structure and entering this kind of, whether we call it dialectical or not, this relation between machine and structure, that's where I would go. I know that's just a dead end. I just wanted to come back so we can definitely.
But why do you think that's a dead end, Taylor?
Oh, I meant that that was almost like a footnote to our previous talk.
But don't you think that it's I mean, that seems to me and also an interesting point of convergence or divergence, right? What the relationship is to the machine, what the relationship is between the machine and the subject, and then what the relationship of all that to the structure is, right? I think that for Deleuze and Guattari, the machine is not part of the structure, right? Like it's which is interesting. I mean, I find that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I think that's important for them that it's not. And I also think, the notion that the machine is not a subject is like and it's I mean, that's strange to me because I think Descartes may be the inventor of modern subjectivity, right? Like he thought of the body as machinic.
Yes.
And so he very much, like, he has this famous thing where he says, because animals he thought were not, he didn't care about animals.
Right.
When you hear an animal crying out in pain, it's like the gears of a clock not working. That's how you should think of it. So, which will, upset.
Charles Barkley said that. No, I'm kidding. Yes.
Descartes was quoting Barkley, I guess. So I think that though the notion of the machine, I don't think is antithetical to the notion of subject. That's what I'm getting at. Like, I think for a whole philosophical tradition, Descartes, Kant, and Hegel even, like, I think that they would say, sure, machine, subject. And I think it's even filmically interestingly confirmed. And this is one of Deleuze's favorite examples. It's Keaton, Buster Keaton, right? Like all of his films are about the way machines are actually subjects.
Mm-hmm. This next quote that I pulled, this goes to Ryan's Star Wars metaphor pretty well, I think.
Nice.
And I think it's a pretty fun one. But it was too late. Something is broken. Maybe there was always something broken between the two of us. But also, has he ever opened up to the other? Has he ever talked to anyone? I wonder. He sets himself up as a despotic signifier. Hasn't he condemned himself to this kind of solitude forever? And that's regarding Lacan directly, which I think goes to that idea of Lacan as Darth Vader and that solitude.
Great statement.
Excellent. Yeah, that's fantastic.
I think it's a great statement. And I think it's why Seminar 17, I'm just going to say it right now, it's bullshit, right? Like, it's just bullshit. And this is his attempt this just shows, I think, that Lacan, he wants to be a master who never who refuses to accept that he's in a position of mastery, and thus invents this thing called analytic discourse, which, okay, whatever, I don't know, maybe it exists in the analytic situation, I don't care, but it certainly doesn't exist outside of it. It certainly doesn't exist when he's giving a seminar, right? And it certainly doesn't exist in an organization that he creates. So there's this whole structure that's institutional, that's one that involves mastery. So it's interesting that he right before he died, 1980, he disbanded his own École Freudienne, and Louis Althusser famously said, "You're not allowed to just disband it. You're not just in charge." But he was the master. Right. So it's like, I think this is perfect. He wants to. I mean, I hope it's clear how much I despise him really personally, and yet I still find him really theoretically, of course, compelling. Yeah. So I think this to me, this is exactly right. He wants mastery, but he doesn't want to avow that he's in the position of the master, which to me that's why I said he's perverse, because I think that's one of the ways perversion functions.
Seminar 17 is where he has the diagrams of the four discourses. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Is that one out? Because I think
yes,
I want to say that it must be 16 that Fink is.
16 is not out.
16 is a brilliant seminar, and it's only in French right now.
Fink is translating it right now. Yeah, I don't know what's supposed to come out, but it's been about a year or more that he said he was working on it last time we corresponded. So
yeah, it's really, so what he invents in Seminar 16 is, so it's from the big other to another, little other. And what he invents there, basically, that's where he says, and this is something that Slavoj talks about, so it gets a lot of currency. It has a lot of currency today. The notion of surplus jouissance as what's actually more fundamental than surplus value, like surplus jouissance.
Oh yeah,
what was at stake. So, and there's also this great discussion of Pascal's wager and the role of objet a. His idea is that what Pascal is really wagering is the objet a. So it's really, because what Pascal says is like, I give up the finite life and all the pleasures, but that's all nothing. And Lacan's like, oh yeah, but it's the nothing of the objet. So
that's good.
Yeah.
Coop, I think you have, is it, I believe the Irish school that may have translated at least a bootleg online?
There is a bootleg of 16 out. Someone gave me.
I'm just giving a shout out to the bootleg translators of the world. sometimes it's necessary.
Unsung heroes, right?
with the pace at which Lacan's work comes out, sometimes going rogue, right, is
Karnak is the name of that, right? Or
Karnak publishes them, yeah, but it's
Cormac Gallagher.
Yeah, the guy is Cormac Gallagher. What's really interesting is he's a very nice guy. He's an apostate, though. So in Ireland, he was like one of the main, and they had a huge split because he just broke from the ranks. So I know a lot of people there, and I'm like, could you put me in touch with Cormac? They're all like, yeah, no, we can't actually.
That's funny.
So he went rogue in more than one sense.
Yeah.
He's the real Han Solo. Yeah.
I would say those translations they're very literal, but I'm going to teach one in the fall. So a seminar 13. So I think that they're usable.
Sometimes you have to err on the side of literality.
It's not bad, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Todd, you mentioned surplus jouissance, and a book that we have covered in great detail on the podcast. We did a whole 7 or 8 part series of episodes on Lyotard's libidinal economy. And I was curious, I noticed there's not one reference to Lyotard and Capitalism Desire that I saw. And I was just kind of curious for both of you, if you've read the text and if you had any general thoughts that you'd be willing to share, primarily because I say jokingly, at least, that I think that the book is one of the best works of fiction of the 20th century in terms of literature.
Nice.
And that's kind of riffing on a quote from Guattari about, what was it? The interpretation of dreams being a fine work of literature as well.
Yeah, no, I haven't read it. So I
have not read it. Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Have you been?
Same for me. Same for me. Yeah, no, that would be a gap.
Honestly, it's Coop's right to say it's a fascinating work of fiction, and his writing style in that book. He disavows it, calls it the evil book, and it is a kind of a frustrating book to read. But your point about surplus jouissance, which I would love for you to expand on if you want to, would fit nicely into some of what Lyotard is working through in that work.
In Seminar 16, he basically, so that's the first time he mentions it, plus de jouir, surplus jouissance. And his idea is that what's given up by the worker is precisely this excess of surplus jouissance. And he doesn't really work this out, which is what makes it frustrating, and what makes me think that Seminar 17, he turns to the discourses as a way of not working out the idea that he develops. And really Seminar 16 sets up is a critique of a psychoanalytic critique of capitalism. And then that doesn't, famously the discourse seminar, it's l'envers de la psychanalyse. What's the English?
The other side.
Other side.
Right. So that seminar famously doesn't have a capitalist discourse. Like he adds that, he's given a talk, I think it's in Rome, he adds this fifth discourse, but that's, some people accept it, some people don't. It has this kind of apocryphal, it's real, but it has this apocryphal status. And so I think it's a kind of retreat from this notion that what's at stake in the capitalist exchange is precisely this, not surplus value, but surplus value depends upon the surplus enjoyment that the worker has been compelled to sacrifice, and that the consumer's trying to purchase but never can, right? That's the whole point. It's the promise of this surplus that you're trying to get, but you can never get it. And so I think, to me, that would have been a fascinating path for a psychoanalytic critique of capitalism that then Lacan just leaves undone.
And you do I think you do a great job filling in some of those gaps, or filling in the dots with the first few chapters of Capitalism Desire. You do work through some of the implications, that gap or that constitutive lack in Lacan's writing. Right.
Well, thank you. That's nice. But I do think that I do it just to say that, I'm just a very simple thinker. I think I do it in a very basic way. And I think Lacan would have done it in a much more complex way. I think it would have there would have maybe been more there. I don't know.
There have been more puns for sure.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Whatever. But I think that it's just too bad. I think, and I think it's the limit of his radicality. He just is he's not really an this famous beginning of seminar. Not the beginning. It's it's a session toward the beginning where he distinguishes between the knave and the fool. We were talking about the fool and the rogue earlier, right? And I think he's much more, and Rogue fits this, he's much more the knave than he is the fool. And he says that the left-wing intellectual is the fool and the right-wing intellectual is the knave. And then he says, well, if you see the journals I have laying around my office, you'll know which side I'm on. And someone jokes, oh, they're right-wing journals. So, so I don't think he was capable of it.
Oh, that's great. I guess we can move on to this next one. This is one of my favorite. I had this actually as the banner on my Twitter account for a while. What's interesting in Lacan is that he is crazier than most people, and that in spite of his efforts to normalize everything, he manages to slip back into deterritorializing the sign. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that what Guattari is referencing specifically is objet a here. But I just thought this notion that Lacan is crazier than most people, and
well, I mean that just goes
as sort of his mad scientist kind of
with what we're talking about, the fool and the knave, and it sounds like something that Zizek would joke about, because I can think of all of his jokes about the liberal father versus the authoritarian father. So I suppose, I mean, Todd, you might, if you could say a little bit more, would the knave have like a presumption of knowing better, but still parades a kind of ignorance, or is it?
The Abe is no open about his criminality. I think.
Gotcha. Okay,
that's the difference. But I'm curious what Ryan thinks about this, because I find a couple of things. I'm not sure why sign.
Yeah, that's my hang up. It's exactly it, Todd. Yeah, I don't know. Because it should be for Lacan. It should be signifier.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Not.
Could be a translation thing, maybe. Perhaps.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe.
Probably not.
I don't think so.
Think so?
No. That would be a terrible mistake.
Okay.
Todd, when did we do sign and signifier? That was years ago.
Long time ago.
Long time ago. So are you wearing a Bengals hat right now?
I am wearing a Bengals hat back.
Oh, okay. Yeah, backwards. Right. You're trying to be young, right?
I know, I did. Someone, can I just tell this?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Someone typed into a YouTube video that I did saying, why do you have your baseball cap on backwards? Are you trying to appear like you're young? And I said, well, it's totally failed. So
yeah.
Oh, Todd, there's a hilarious picture. It's like you were at this conference on libidinal economics, I think, or capitalism and desire, and the way that the YouTube thumbnail, it's like you're looking like this. You have this great look of like utter it's such a great. I'm gonna have to find it and email it to you.
I would like that, but I
fantastic.
thought you were talking. So in 2008, I went to this thing in Croatia, and it was like a pleasure conference or something. Okay. And part of the thing was, it was like about having as much pleasure as you can have. There were no chairs. So everyone had to lie on beanbags, and they had to give their talks on beanbags. And so I refused. I said, I'm not giving my talk on a beanbag. So I sat on my knees, and I could barely walk the whole day. So it was really a very unpleasurable thing, but that's not what you're talking about. But Brian,
there it is.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That's that look good. Right there. That's great, right?
Yeah. Someone must have asked me about
about Derrida and Guattari.
What? I've seen that look in class. Years ago. Actually, that I forget what someone. You know what? I'm not going to blow up your spot on this. I'm gonna undo the story that I was about to tell you. So what I was saying about Todd's hat is that so he has it backwards, and so it's functioning right now as signifier. If he had it the other way around, you have the Bengals logo, then there's sign. And that was just something we went into years ago on the pocket, just to give a really, really quick split for anybody listening. So it's hard for me. I don't know what Guattari's getting out of what he's thinking through. Lacan is doing in that kind of language. That's me.
Gotcha.
I don't know, Todd, if that's what you were thinking.
Yeah, that's what I was getting to. Right? Why? I don't think Lacan necessarily cares about the sign.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, here's I guess the question: Lacan is trying to expose the torsion of signification, right? Like the way in which signifying turns on itself and undermines itself. Is that deterritorializing it? I think
that sounds right.
So maybe it is. So maybe there's the way that does kind of coincide.
At this point, Guattari had left Lacan's tutelage for at least 2 years, and he's immersed in all of this, especially someone like Peirce. He's immersed in all these other linguists, and so the fact that he just says sign as a stand-in for what Lacan is doing, I don't necessarily think that's probably more of a quirk on his part than anything to do with Lacanian terminology.
Right. Yeah, it seems like it's his reading. That's yeah.
But isn't it important though? For Lacan, the signifier represents the subject for another signifier.
Right.
The sign, this is basic. The sign represents the subject for another subject. So that, it's interesting because it's not how we usually think of signifier. I think most people, if they said, what's a signifier do? Oh, that's what I'm representing something for someone else.
Right.
But no, he's saying it's actually you're representing it for another signifier. And that's why the hat on backwards. And I think that reading, by that very ungenerous reading, but it's not bad, right? Her point is, who are you wearing that? What signifier are you wearing that backwards hat for? Because it's not for me. If it was a sign, it would just be for me as a subject, but it's not for me as a subject. It's for some imaginary, not imaginary in the Lacanian sense, but some position out there that of a big other that you're trying to speak to.
And be validated by.
Exactly.
This seems, a little bit reminding me of our earlier discussion about why Deleuze and Guattari kind of fit together and why they needed each other. And one of the things I was thinking about was you see throughout Anti-Oedipus and in 1,000 Plateaus, probably in the Kafka book too, but this insistence that there's no metaphor, right? That machines aren't metaphor. And I'm sure they bring up autonomy too, but this seems to be trying to be in dialogue with Lacan and saying that they're sort of attempting this writing flush with the real, or that they're describing this writing flush with the real, which obviously has Lacanian resonances. And so that seems to perhaps be where Guattari wouldn't necessarily follow the same logic that you were describing, Todd, with how Lacan defines those terms. It would be interesting to see what you and Ryan or Coop had to think about that.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because I would say that for Lacan, metaphor is absolutely fundamental.
Yes.
Right? There's the notion that you're somehow getting at the real without a paternal metaphor, he would just say paternal is just indifferent, right? The master's metaphor, not necessarily father. It's structural. So I think the notion without some fundamental metaphorical substitution of something for nothing,
right?
Then we don't have any way to touch the real at all. So I think that's, to me, a real fundamental difference. Can you somehow find a way of speaking without speaking, which I think is what Deleuze and Guattari would like to do. Maybe you can, or writing without writing, maybe you can invent a style that does that. Or do you understand that, the way I put it is already prejudicing, and do you understand that in order to get to that real, you have to deform through the symbolic. That I don't think that there's any way to have both. And I think metaphor, it's interesting because I think metaphor really is where the rubber hits the road on that. Are you invested in this fundamental metaphoric substitution of something for nothing, or are you not?
I think that for Lacan, I think he would probably say the position that Deleuze and Guattari take up a psychotic's position, because in the position of the psychotic is really to take literally that which is metaphorical or has social symbolic resonance and to refuse. And it would sort of be like, I don't know if I told the story on the podcast before. It's just a minor one from when I was at Walmart. Was when one time I was working at a new Walmart, and because my store, the one that I worked at, was being rebuilt. And what everyone did all the time was they used their measly 5% discount on snacks when they're on a 15-minute break. Now, you're not literally supposed to do that. Now, it's like it's against the rules to do that. But everyone did it. Every single person did it. It was just understood because there was the rule and then there was the social symbolic rule.
Right.
And I remember the first time that I did this at this new Walmart, the person didn't even, it was so funny. Like the person that they were checking out, which was a regular customer before, you hit the button to make the thing roll, the conveyor belt. And then they saw me, they saw the badge that I was working here. They saw my snacks, they hit the thing and then they stop it. So there was like a real nice sonic element to this. It was like, stop. And then they look at what I had there and they look at me. I'm like, are you on the clock? And I was like, yeah, I'm just going to go take a 15. I can't do it. What do you mean you can't do it? Everyone does. You're on the clock. And that's the psychotic's position. Because this person explained later in this exchange is that they could be fired for doing that, which is literally true. And it would never happen.
Right.
Ever. It would never happen. That one thing. If they wanted to fire you because for other reasons, then they would say, yeah, that's the thing they did it. But it's not because you did that thing. So now I've shifted the conversation to a Walmart metaphor, but as I want to do. So Lacan would be on the side for the symbolic rule in that exchange. And then in this, it's Deleuze and Guattari, they want to pay attention to the utter literality of it, which Lacan would consider and the position of the psychotic, which for them is freeing. And that is how, for them, that's how you escape. Because I think what they would say, if they were that person on the other side of the exchange with me, if I'm going to be fair to that position, is that I'm trying to get away with something within the symbolic law that I don't see how. I think that symbolic law is in some way freeing, but it's actually that which is oppressive. And that in obedience to the literal, there's a way of finding a way out that I have decided, I've disavowed for myself, that I've foreclosed. I think that would be the two different sides of that situation.
That makes perfect sense talking about it as a psychotic perspective. 2 weeks ago, we were reading through Abraham and Turok's The Wolfman's Magic Word, and together they wrote an essay called Mourning or Melancholia. And one of the things that they isolate in this building of the crypt and the cryptonymic sense that they work out is one of the elements is demetaphorization. So taking the figurative literally. And so I think that resonates very much with what you just said.
You know what I like about that is I don't know if you've ever had to, I don't know how many times you had to register a car in a new state, but I had my first car, my parents helped me buy. And there's a thing with the title. It said Ryan Engley, and my father's name is Chuck, Ryan Engley and Chuck Engley. And I was trying to get it registered in Rhode Island, and they were like, "We can't do this. The title holder's not here." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? I'm right here." And I'm like, "No." And they're like, "See, it's Ryan and Chuck. I'm right here. Why do we need him?" And they're like, "It's and." But what they told me was, I was like, "But why do you, I'm just one of, why don't you?" And they're like, "If it said Ryan Engley or Chuck Engley, then we could do it." So I like that. Melancholy and melancholia, or melancholy or melancholia. Anyway, so yeah. It's
that non-connective synthesis, or is that what? Not the exclusive disjunction, but that's what you need, the inclusive disjunction instead of the. It's not segregated. No, I'm. Doesn't matter. Coop, you want to keep us rolling?
Yeah. Yes.
Brought us to Walmart and the DMV. That's my fault.
Hey, we tend to diverge. We kind of have to have a free association model for the most part when it comes to the podcast. So we may, I've prepared 30 pages of notes for episodes, and we'll just start riffing, and it's good. So
there you go.
We'll print the episode, so to speak. Just a quick comment, and I may reveal my own ignorance here, but I was just going back to what Todd said. I was thinking about asignification is a big thing for Guattari. I don't know if that had any relevance specifically to what Todd was saying in terms of finding a way to write without writing or speak without speaking. That's kind of the best I can describe it. And so I just wanted to throw that
Cooper, I think fun. That's what it is. I mean, I think that's what they're trying to do. Right? Yeah. So I just think that's Lacan would say that's a psychotic effort, just like Ryan was saying. And that it's impossible. I mean, part of what he thinks is that by foreclosing the name of the father, you don't eliminate the name of the father, right? That's the problem. That's why for Lacan, the psychotics or the schizophrenics rebellion or revolution even is actually a feigned one, because there always will be that metaphor in the background, just unavowed. So that I think that's why Verwerfung is the German that he gets from Freud, but it's this notion of foreclosure, which if you guys just talked about Seminar 3, you talked about this probably quite a bit. That I think that fits with and that's what Ryan was talking about with what Deleuze and Guattari are doing. But I think you're right. Asignification would be part of that. How do you write without that initial metaphor, right?
Right.
Why I needed my dad to register my car.
Yeah, or that. Yeah.
Next, I have a couple of quotes. I'm going to read these together. These are referencing Freud a bit, and I think these go back to maybe earlier on in the conversation and maybe even kind of move us forward towards maybe BPP a little bit and death drive, etc. Guattari says here, the Freudian unconscious has no subject. Returning to Freud requires not putting any in there at whatever cost. Next passage, at the level of repressed and deterritorialized residues, supports for a new power, a new asubjective filiation, the Freudian unconscious, reduced to the in Lacan, potentially sublimation, diagrammatization. It seems to me that Lacan eliminates this order of polyvocality by turning it into linguistics. For example, when he declares that the primary process comes down to the Jakobson's metaphor and metonymy. That said, in practice, his fanatical attitude of reducing analysis to language leads to the schizophrenization of analysis, which is, of course, positive. Which I love this quote too. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, this is really interesting. It's a really nice quote that you picked, Cooper, because it shows the split. And this is the big. So Lacan and Freud and Todd and I and slap, just like the Joan Kopchak, and there's a choice to be made. Like, are you on the side of the two, which is what psychoanalysis is, right, or are you on the side of the multiple? And that's where Guattari finds himself here, and that's what ends up being the project that they articulate. And I mean, and it's not just them. As Derrida does it as well. I mean, I think Judith Butler is on the side of the multiple, certainly, and here it's a vocality or polyphony or so. Yeah. Because I'm indebted to Joan Kopchak. I just one time in class, I remember her saying that, like, the multiple gives you many, it doesn't give you more. And this was part of her argument for fidelity to the two, and for her absolute fidelity to the non-relation of the two that Lacan introduces, particularly in Seminar 20. And that you don't have a relationship with another. Like, I think actually the Zoom situation is really great for this example, because we are literally in the same space, but we're not. We're actually figuratively in the same space, but like on a screen, literally we're in the same space. We're not seeing all of each other. We're seeing like from the chest up, like all four of us, and more or less what the relationship we're having right now is not with each other, but it's with our voices.
Right.
And that is an object for Lacan. So, and that's part of the non-relation. You're not having a relationship with a whole person, WHOLE. You're having a relationship with a whole person, HOLE, as I like to put it. You are all having a relationship right now with my voice. It's going to fail to coincide, because what I mean for me is not what I'll mean for you, but you're going to understand me in a certain way. And this conversation is going to move forward, and we're going to run with that. And that's what's going to happen. And it's so the impossibility of saying all in language is what allows for that more to come through. I think it's arguable that Guattari is seeing this in the same way, but from a different angle, or as Bob Dylan saying, we always did feel the same. We just saw it from a different point. I think that's it. For Lacan, it has to be in this two. It has to be in this non-relation for there to be a proliferation of signification. And that, I think, like, as we've kind of gotten to, like, for Deleuze and Guattari for Guattari at this time, like, that's a limiting situation that doesn't allow for like they want to get out of that. So anyway, yeah, Todd.
No, I think that's really good. I mean, I obviously totally agree with that. I also think I want to talk about the first quotation you read, Cooper, because I don't think so, I guess. I think the Freudian unconscious, that is what he means by subject. So I think it doesn't have a subject in the sense that it doesn't have a traditional subject of mastery, right? But I don't think that we should read subjectivity as subject of mastery. And so that, I think, to me, that's what subjectivity is also one of these really crucial points, right? Where Deleuze and Guattari really don't want to invoke subjectivity at all, because they associate it with mastery over the field, like the visual field, oral field, whatever. But I think here, unconscious, to suggest that the subject is at least primarily unconscious, is to suggest that it's not mastery, but it's actually subjectivity is what Hegel means by it. And this comes back to Ryan's point. Subjectivity means that you're cut in. And so you're always cut in two. You're never able to coincide with yourself. And I agree with what Ryan was saying, that I would just add this, that multiplicity can hide that cut within the subject. And I think that's why figures like Joan and Slavoj find that multiplicity a bit of anathema, because it has the effect of obfuscating contradiction. And so I think that, like if you have the multiple, you don't see the contradiction in the one or the two. I guess that would be how I would put it.
And as Todd said earlier, like this is also why I think, as I think has been made clear, we don't like Lacan as a person, but we really like the theory because it exceeds the person. As Todd pointed out, Lacan introduces with surplus jouissance in Seminar 16 is a contradiction that he leaves. It's a cut he tries to flee from. So even though he understands there is no sexual relation, he understands this non-relation, he understands the cut, he understands the two, he understands not avoiding a contradiction, like contradiction at the, I don't think that's like a very Hegelian way to put it. So I don't think he would have thought of it that way. Exactly. But he understood the idea, the contradiction at the heart of subjectivity. And yet he's still not in all cases does he follow that through. And like that, rather than, it's one of those things where like it undermines him as a figure, but it validates the theory. That is a kind of a torsion that we like to play on and think on and work through.
The way I read this statement from Guattari that the Freudian unconscious has no subject in it's almost like a wager, and it is polemical because for Lyotard in libidinal economy, the one way that Lacan keeps showing back up in the book is it's a fundamental disagreement about whether it be showcasing or foregrounding the subject or subjectivity. And for Lyotard, he wants to wager and fight against that. And I think that Deleuze and Guattari take that up similarly in their way of, when they read Freud, they say that there's no fixed object, there's only a fixed subject, right? And this is related to Freud's, obviously, his concept of fixation. And so I think they too struggle against one of the stakes of Lacan's, you could see it throughout his work, which is this fundamental stake of figuring out what role the subject plays in analysis in life, and how Lacan is constantly trying to say that the subject is not the ego, right? And that's one of the, at least in the early seminars, that seems to be one of his fundamental points that he always returns to. And so in that sense, I wonder if any of that can kind of shed light on this break, this epistemic break, or this, whether it merely be even like a linguistic break, and why, the machinic becomes foregrounded for Deleuze and Guattari as a way of scuttling the subject.
Yeah, Taylor, that's interesting. So I guess what I don't get, I agree totally, this critique of the ego, right? Like that's incredibly important for Lacan, but I don't think that for Guattari that goes far enough, right? As long as Lacan and psychoanalysis retain subjectivity, that seems to be the problem, right? So, and I guess I keep getting hung up on this Freudian unconscious has no subject. And I guess for me, and the notion that, and then in the second quotation that Cooper read, like that the Freudian unconscious is reduced to the A, and Lacan, I guess I don't see that as a reduction. Or do I see it as like that's the extent of the unconscious? Like I think he would say the unconscious is wider than that. But,
yes.
But I also think A is, why wouldn't Deleuze and Guattari think the A is this important break, this important cut in signification? Because I think that's what it is. And so I guess I don't get why reduced is the gerund attached to the objet, because it just doesn't seem, I don't know, it doesn't seem like that's like it's a reduction to me.
And this is where reading the papers can be, I assume, Coop, this is from the
yes.
This is where reading the papers can be confusing sometimes, because a lot of the positions actually change or are not retained. And this obviously doesn't make it into the to Anti-Oedipus, one of the things that they actually give credit to Serge Leclerc for is coming up with this machinic objet, whether they calls it objet X or machinic objet A. They take that and run with it. But this critique doesn't. It's at least transformed in the published book. I do think that you're right. That is confusing to say that the Freudian unconscious would be, whether he means that it is reduced to the or if Lacan reduces.
I think he's saying Lacan reduces.
Yeah, which seems like a productive misreading, right?
If I don't think misreading at all, but I mean, I think that yeah, I don't know.
If I were reading it charitably in line with how you work through objet and capitalism and desire, it does seem like you guys can have a rapprochement on this point, basically being that it is this question of desire ceaselessly missing the object that would be full satisfaction.
Right, that is true, but objet, that's just the imaginary dimension of objet. So objet also has this real dimension to it as well. So that,
interesting.
Which I think that's again why the term reduction seems to miss the real, which I think that Guattari would want to embrace. It's
unfortunate. I know we've dumped on Seminar 17 a little bit, but it's unfortunate, but I think for a good reason, because what Lacan, this is, I think, our position. We haven't done an episode on it yet. Spoiler alert. Position is that what he tries to do, I mean, as Todd said earlier, he tries to find a way to structurally eliminate his own position of mastery, and in so doing just finds another way to kind of calcify it. But what's unfortunate about that being the project is that it is in with the four discourses, and as I think the most charitable way to put it is, Todd, as your friend Rick Boothby puts it, is that Lacan's moving from the triadic to the quadratic. And in this move to the quadratic, and this comes out a lot in Seminar 23 that is published in English, the official one, the one on the Santome, is how inextricable the three orders are. So as Todd just said, that it certainly occurred to Lacan in stages, his three orders. And you can, if you stop at a certain point, they can seem related, of course, but a little separate. Like you can separate their dimensionality from each other. But as he goes further in his career, they just become, you can't separate anything and anything. It sounds, you get into jargony gibberish, but there's an imaginary dimension of the real. There's a symbolic dimension to the real. There's a real dimension of the real. And the best working through of this, I think, we're both agreed on this, is the preface to the second edition of Zizek's For They Know Not What They Do. He spends a lot of time working through it, and it's quite good. But I don't know that I guess I don't totally blame Guattari for the idea of the reduction here, because it's a Lacan, it's a progressive understanding as well, that these ideas are, that's where you get the knots. Like you can't, you can't separate one from the other. And he's focusing on one dimension here, and that's that is, I mean, I think that almost comes from like Lacan himself, not making that as clear as it probably should be.
And that's a good point, because it just the chronology, it would show that Lacan really starts to concretize the inextricability of the three orders only a few years after these little notes. I assume 16 would be in the early mid 70s.
16's in the 60s.
Okay.
Yeah, because 11 is 65, I think.
Right, then 11 64, I think. 64.
Oh, so then Guattari doesn't have an excuse, and that's okay.
Well, I think Ryan's right to talk about the Bromian knot, because it's when. I mean, I lament this very much, that he got to deal with these knots. But the point of the knot is that the three, like you pull one out and take one of the string out and the whole knot falls apart. And that's the idea of the relation between RSI, real imaginary, and symbolic imaginary.
And that seminar is not out.
RSI is not out.
It does seem, though, that this is, from what I've read about this move towards the knots, is Lacan becoming more, what's the word? I was going to make a pun, but it's not good. Lacan becoming more reticent in his seminars, and almost as though the knots were a way of speaking without speaking, to come back to some of this stuff that we we mentioned earlier.
It's very good. It's very good.
Sure.
And I think you're right to say that. It comes back to what Cooper said about asignification, right? Like, I think that maybe this is a point at which I think, again, I lament this later turn. Like, I think for me, after 16, like, dead letter, but okay. But I think, that's probably overstated. And I have friends that just think that the sexual non-relation is so important. But
do you know, sorry, Todd, I have to interrupt you and you should finish, but I know someone who in their dissertation, they're quoting me calling you slash and burn McGowan. So anyway, just
that's what I was just doing. But anyway,
yes,
but my point is that I think that you could say, couldn't you, that Lacan is being influenced back by Deleuze and Guattari in those later seminars, that the whole stuff with the knots is his own later allergy to representation, because the knot is not, and he even said, what's interesting, Ryan alluded to the seminar, it's in French, it's RSI, right? Like RSI. That seminar, RSI doesn't stand for anything, right? Like, it's not, he even says it's not real symbolic imaginary, it's RSI and the way they intersect. So I think that is a really interesting thing that you could read this causality back into. And so that my then rejection of the late Lacan is actually just another rejection of Deleuze and Guattari.
Yes, absolutely.
A rejection of Lacan.
We're working through these.
That's magnificent.
Symptoms.
That's magnificent. That's so good.
Yeah,
that's really funny.
I wasn't going to read this one because it's a little bit incendiary, but I don't know. I feel like we're on a good track.
Yeah, we're on a good track.
Yeah.
Slash and burn.
Here comes right there. Here comes this. Is going to drop some napalm on you with this one. This is another quote from Guattari. Who is talking? Who is desiring? Asked Lacan. It's the other, but the other is a machine, not mommy, daddy. The schizoanalytic revolution is about moving beyond the splitting of the ego, beyond Kleinian explosion. We can't be satisfied with fighting a losing battle anymore. We have to go on the offense. Rather than submit to the splitting, we have to go forward to the subject of enunciation. We're not describing replacement scenes, psychodramatic scenes, psychoanalytic scenes, but abolishing the subject by constructing collective agents of enunciation.
Interesting.
God, I love this quote. Sorry.
No, it's fascinating, really. The other thing is it reminds me that the last line, even though Badiou wouldn't say it this way, it reminds me a lot of Alain Badiou, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the notion of, he would say we're constructing the subject by constructing collective agents of enunciation. But I think that just because for him the subject is always collective, it's always the subject of the event.
Yes.
So there's no subject of the signifier for Badiou, which I think is interesting because that puts him more proximate to Deleuze or to Guattari in this sense. But I think I think a lot of this I don't necessarily disagree with. I think that although it's important that he says when he says it's the other, he doesn't say capital big other, right? I think that, because I think who is talking, who's desiring, asked Lacan, it's the big other,
yes.
right? Like, it's not the other. It's not like that little other, imaginary or real, has to be got to visa through the big other. So I think, and the big other is a machine, and I think not mommy, daddy. I think that's all right.
Yeah.
I think so. There's a way. I think one thing I like about Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus is that they're trying to move the focus from the family to the social structure that structures the family. And I think Lacan...
That's very Lacanian.
I know. I was going to say
I was
going to say that. Right. Like that's a way in which what they're doing. Again, I really think I insist on negation and representation, but that part of the project, that part of like moving that emphasis, I think is 100% correct. I have no quarrel with that at all. So to me, the critique of Oedipus, I think, is right on. Like, I think that is a and I think Lacan himself there's a divide between Lacanians on this Oedipus question, really significant divide. But I think I think is right. And I think going forward to the subject of enunciation, I think that's right. I mean, I don't think it's through abolishing the subject that you construct collective agents of enunciation. However, I think it's only by embracing the subject that you construct the collective. But that's a theoretical dispute.
Right. But I mean, you're right to bring in Badiou here about the collective agents of enunciation, because it fits very well in with his discussion of fidelity. right? I mean, I don't know if Guattari would like that word choice, but theoretically, they would be very close.
I think that's right, Taylor. Like the way in which for Badiou, because isn't he also, I was thinking about the minor, when we were just thinking about this thing coming on the show, and the minor really, I mean, like for Deleuze and Guattari, it's the minor has to be a becoming, right? And so that yes. I think doesn't necessarily coincide with what psychoanalysis does, but I think that that notion of the minor, I think, does fit with what Badiou calls the location for the event, or what for psychoanalysis is something like the position of non-belonging, right? And I think it's interesting that for Deleuze and Guattari, minor and major doesn't mean a quantity; it means a certain structural position,
right?
And I think that is that structural position, the privileging of the minor, and then they go, like in the Kafka book, it's right, becoming woman, becoming animal, all these different things. Like in a way, that fits right in with a certain Badiou, Lacan way of thinking about this certain structural position.
Right.
That then is the site of radicality. So for Badiou, that becomes the site of the event. For Lacan, it's the site of some kind of a rupture, some kind of a breakthrough of the real.
What you were saying about Badiou and the minor, it reminded me of him with his warnings in his book on his essay on evil, right? His book on the event, which he wrote for high schoolers, but I find very constructive in terms of fleshing out some more ideas of the subject's relation to the event, which is particularly one of the concerns is that there is no full event, right? There's no privileged event for privileged subjects. It's got to have a sort of foundation of universality, lest fascism and these other bugbears sort of creep back in.
Right, Taylor. It's why 9/11 is not an event, really. Because for whom, like, what did that do? That just, to use a word I used earlier, that just calcified already racist, like right. Islamophobic, Arab country. Like, so it did not lift up. And also controversially, this is also why he doesn't think the Holocaust is an event, because it didn't lift up. That did not lift up Jewish people. That event, yeah, Todd.
Well, I would just say Steven Spielberg thought it did.
Yeah, well, that's that great line, right? The Stanley Kubrick. I think we said it a long time ago on the show that, like,
Kubrick's line.
Kubrick was asked once if there's any topic that couldn't be filmed, and he said the Holocaust. And someone said
Kubrick said you can't make a great film about the Holocaust, and the screenwriter he was with says, what about Schindler's List? And Kubrick says, Schindler's List was a film about 1,000 Jews who lived. Holocaust is about 6 million Jews who died. Which is great. I mean, it's exactly right.
Well, Badiou himself says death is not an event.
That's right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It's absolutely true. I want to say two things, though. So first of all, I think he wrote that book for high schoolers in French, which means in America, it's for people that have a PhD, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing I would say is that I think that the notion that death cannot be event, there's no negativity to the event, that puts, I think, even though Badiou wrote this scandalous book on Deleuze, right? Like that every Deleuzean hates, right? But in a way, there's more proximity, I think, between Badiou and Deleuze because of this attitude toward negation than there is between Badiou and Zizek. I really think that because Badiou there is no space for negativity, I think, in Badiou's thought. And for him, death is really, it's not a problem like it is or negation isn't a problem like it is for, I mean, like he's not and this is why also he's not a dialectical thinker. And I think that also puts him, the event and the situation are not dialectically related. The event is just, it's a whole, it's not, right. In that sense, it's not real like Lacan, because for Lacan, real is dialectically related to symbolic, right? So that's why you can't just say, Badiou's event is like the real no, it cannot be because of that. And I think that it's interesting that there's, despite their polemics and despite Badiou's hostility to Deleuze, but I think there still is more of a connection there, precisely because of this thing that I want to insist on is a fundamental negativity. And I see like radical action as tied to a fundamental negativity. And that seems to me a real split between what I would call Hegelian psychoanalytic dialectical position and the Deleuzian Guattarian position.
Badiou's book on Deleuze, I love how he does preface it by saying It's not necessarily written in bad faith or maliciously, even though it's taken that way.
Right.
But that what I focused on was he indicates a kind of sibling rivalry, right? That they're so close, they're almost these blood brothers, even if they focus on, whether it be Deleuze on algebra and Badiou on calculus, et cetera. I mean, I think I'm getting it the reverse. Sorry, Badiou on calculus. But you see what I mean? That they do come close on and Badiou kind of espouses that there is this brotherhood there.
I think that's right. I think it's right. And I think, it's just, I don't know if this reveals anything, but it's a lot better than his book on Lacan, right? You come away from the book on Deleuze saying, okay, I have a new way of thinking about Deleuze that I didn't have before. It could be right, it could be wrong, but you come away from his Lacan book and you're like, I have got nothing new about
Interesting.
Lacan. I feel like, I mean, maybe that's because I know more about Lacan when I read it, so that might not be
Makes
fair.
Sense,
but I do think every Deleuzean I know thinks the book on Deleuze is unfair. But it is, what's interesting is he kind of does to Deleuze, don't you think, what Deleuze does to every other thinker? Like
it's totally buggery.
Yeah.
It is, and that's how I chose to read Organs Without Bodies. I know that people around Zizek apparently discouraged him from publishing the book, but what I take it as this epic joke that you think it's a book on Deleuze and it's the first 20 pages talk about him, but then the next 200 are on Hegel. And I just think that's his own way of telling a kind of buggery joke.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. When people say, well, Zizek wrote a book on Deleuze, I'm like, no, have you read it?
Not really, no.
He didn't. He wrote another book on Hegel. It's pretty good. I think it's pretty good, but it's not a book on Deleuze.
If you come to it expecting a book on Deleuze, then you will be triggered or
disappointed
upset.
Because look, there are these things. You're right, Taylor. First 20 pages, look, Deleuze says this. It's like Hegel said. Sorry, it's not. It's just not. Like, you have to be fair to Deleuze. If there's one political and philosophical opponent he has, it's Hegel. Right? That's from beginning to end. I think.
Yeah.
When he says Nietzsche's philosophy of the Übermensch has absolutely nothing to do with the dialectical structure of Hegel. And I think it's an anti-Oedipus. It's just from beginning to A to Z, it's rejection of Hegel. So I don't think you can, I love Slavoj and I like every book that he wrote, but I think that one, I think it's good, but I think it just can't be done. You can't make Deleuze into a Hegelian.
There is a very brave book by Veronique Bergen. It's called Deleuze's Ontology. It's this massive tome. Anyway, she sets up what she argues will be reading Deleuze and Hegel as each other's dark night. And I find that intriguing, at least in its ambition. Whether she succeeds or not, I think that is where you would have to go to really, because I think for Zizek, he it's not a cop-out necessarily, but he doesn't, as I said, it's a buggery, it's a joke, but that's where you're totally right. Where if you were going somewhere pushing Deleuze to the limit or whatever you want to call it, it would be this productive, whether misreading it or not, this productive buggery, this Hegelian buggery of Deleuze. And I think that he would enjoy that because even if he calls Kant and Hegel enemies, there's something about, whether it be his Spinozist, soul or whatever, there's something, whether it be his affirmationism or whatever.
Right. He shouldn't be allowed to reject anyone. Right?
Yes, exactly. So even it's Hegel's more of a frenemy, right? Because there's I don't think Deleuze really has that hateful bone in his body. And I always
except there's not one single, I think, Deleuze better than me, but I don't think there's one single positive statement on Hegel in his entire philosophical corpus.
It's interesting though, because Hegel does do a lot of work for him in difference and repetition, even if he takes Hegel as his foil or it's always productive there at least. And I feel like that has a lot to do with his work on the Jean Hippolyte. And I wonder if the Hegel renunciation is a part of that kind of that Oedipal struggle with his dissertation chair, and him saying like he and Foucault were one of the last generations to be like schooled in this old school philosophy. And you brought up yourself Lacan's attending of the lectures of Kojève, and how important that is, and how you can't overlook, even if Zizek wants to make a perfect synthesis of Lacan and Hegel, that I think Lacan stays true to a kind of tension between the Freudian dialectic and the Hegelian one, which we've talked about before in the Subversion of the Subject essay. But yeah, I mean, before we end, Coop.
Taylor. Hold on, Taylor. I want to
please respond. Please respond.
No, I want to interrupt. No, just because it keeps coming up. I think what we've come to, this has come up a number of different times. Todd and I mean, we agreed perhaps fundamentally with a Deleuze and Guattari thing, which is that we don't make that much of the Oedipal situation as we try not to give that much explanatory power to it. And what has come up a number of different times is not the father relationship, but a sibling one. I think you've used that word a couple different times. There's one book that I know of that does psychoanalysis and seriality. And it's by Juliet Mitchell. It's called Siblings: Sex and Violence. And what she gets into in that book, it's a really interesting claim, just to reproduce it in a sentence. It's not that long of a book, but it's that siblings are a series. So you can see this with twins even, or Todd, you have fraternal twin. Yeah, right. Yeah. So her claim is that it's someone who it's like you, but it's not you. It's this repetition, but it's also not. And it's a minimal difference, and it's not enough. And it's on that level of that minimal difference, and I think what we're getting to, it's on that level of proximity that creates this tension. Right. And so what produces the tension in Badiou's Deleuze book, it's their proximity. Yeah. What produces, the tension between Guattari and Lacan, it's actually their proximity. Yep. Like that. I think that would be like another way of looking at it. And I think it's more productive than looking at it as the Oedipal relation. Like, I mean, because I think it was the second episode we did on Deleuze where I mentioned to a friend of mine that I was doing this Deleuze triptych about, and they're like, well, isn't Anti-Oedipus the most Oedipal book? And I just don't think that's like a real engagement with that thing. On the one hand, totally is, but it doesn't really get into anything. It doesn't really explain anything. And so I think that looking at the frenemy, the proximity of the sibling and this tension, I think is there's a little more juice to it. I guess I put it that way. And
Deleuze and Hegel then could be,
yes, exactly. Well, it's funny. Well, it's really funny because you brought this up in Difference of Repetition. Like I lose my mind about this line from Deleuze because it's like on page 74 or something. And it's just, I think I'm going to have it exactly right because I've like quoted it somewhere. A contradiction does not pose much of a problem for Hegel, period. It's something like that. And I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? That's his whole thing.
That is funny.
But it's actually, if you read Deleuze as like it's Deleuze's reading, he's actually talking about himself. Contradiction, he wants to find a way out of that deadlock. And so he sees in Hegel someone who doesn't find a satisfying way out of that deadlock. And that's how he positions his project. So I think that like it's at the level of proximity that you get maybe a more productive tension than in that. I think in a Juliet Mitchell, to reference her, because I think she's great, it's more of a sibling relationship than it is an Oedipal one. Yeah.
Yeah. Deleuze is the bearded Hegel, right? The beardless Marx, the bearded Hegel. Yeah, I think that's good. I was going to suggest, Coop, before we go, you did want to mention at least something about Death Drive, or
go ahead, Ryan.
Coop. Yeah, this is a great this is a great section. But my only thing there, someone tweeted that Jameson, I guess, in a lecture somewhat recently said cathexis is, and he paused, a stupid made up word.
What? The great irony is that I love the word cathexis.
It has a poetic ring to it, but conceptually.
Yes, the aesthetics of it, not necessarily the signification or
it's mooring to the translation or the idea.
I don't know. It just sounds, I don't know. Cathected, cathexis. It has a good. There's some jouissance in there.
Yeah, I mean there is something, and maybe because of its stupidity. It has
that would be a nice
value.
That's a nice.
I mean,
turn.
I had a professor Nouvet at Emory, and she hated anaclysis because we were doing Laplanche, and you know how important it is to talk about the propping of the sexual drives on the self-preservative drives. And I think Strachey may translate it sometimes as attachment or attach. I could be wrong. So. Yeah. Which I think is unfavorable because later with attachment theory, right? I'm wondering, I mean, at the time, would instinct have had all the commonplace?
I think so, because it's post-Darwin. So
yeah, okay. I'm being devil's advocate.
I think it would. So
speaking
Ryan,
of attachment,
can you find something worthwhile in this garbage?
So Cooper, did you want to read it or as you've been doing? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to, all right, here you go.
I'll read. And I think actually, Todd, you've really sort of just, I mean, this isn't really saying anything specific. I think you've even addressed this directly just in terms of the revolution of 1920. But I'll go ahead and read. If we understand death instincts here as the subject's attachment to loss, this brief sentence at the conclusion of Freud's brief book provides the most thoroughgoing critique of capitalism that anyone has ever written. The recognition that we are not really pursuing pleasure frees us from the chains of capitalism more completely than any other revolutionary gesture.
Todd, no,
certainly
no.
bombastic enough, right? Like, geez, like who the hell writes like that? That's just terrible.
Oh, you guys should read Lyotard and
yeah, that's pretty good. So Todd, I'm gonna not allow him to do the self-deprecating thing, because what he gets at in the book, and that I think is singularly worthwhile. There you go. Is the like you'll see this everywhere. Thomas Piketty, like even like left-wing economists like Dean Baker, you even see it in popular, even don't make the opinion pages of New York Times or whatever, is that like, look at how irrational capitalism is. How can we continue to do? Look, shouldn't we refuse? And it's at the level of logic, like it's this objective thing, like we can choose it and enter into it. And what Todd's whole thing is that, yeah, actually we have an attachment to a psychical attachment to capitalism that has not yet been explored. And it is at this level that is why it continues to proliferate. It has nothing to do with logic. It has nothing to do with markets. It has nothing even to do with the actual power, in inverted commas, that a certain corporate entity or group of corporations may have. It's actually a psychical attachment to it. So I'm going to give a concrete example of a psychical attachment to Todd. And I can't remember if this is an example that ends up in your book, but in the US, and I mean, other countries have this too, but it's really prominent in the US that there is an attachment to working yourself to the bone. 80 hours. You're a surgeon doing 100 hours a week. It's not about the specific surgeon. That's what it is to be a surgeon, is you're working 80, 100-hour weeks. In our field, in academia, I just saw this, I forget who did this, that to be a professor is actually 67 smaller jobs. Someone broke this down, and this is why people get burned out. But there is just this, you see this fantasy, this attachment to the idea of the educator that is killing themselves for the kids. And they're doing, in high school or grade school, they're doing all kinds of volunteer drives to get supplies for the students. Is like, isn't this uplifting? Look at what these people
right.
And all of this amounts to is this attachment to a system that runs on you not being compensated for all of this labor that you're putting into it. And it runs on, and this where the surplus jouissance becomes the thing. It is at this level of attachment to the system that it works ideologically. And one of the most important things that Zizek wrote about ideology is he imports this line of Marx, which is that, they don't know what they're doing, but they're doing it. And the reason why that's important is that if you don't have this as part of your notion of ideology and why capitalism is so rampant, then it is just all rational, thoughtful actors doing things intentionally. And then that ends up being, I almost think that where does the conspiracy theorist diverge from something that's actually close reading? And I think it's here, where people are doing something, they're propping up the system, they're helping it reproduce itself exactly as it is now, and they don't know that they're doing it. And part of it is this psychical attachment really to a status quo that invalidates one. And it is through that attachment that one finds a jouissance in this invalidating and malicious and destructive system.
Yeah.
So
but Ryan, all I would say is the destructiveness of it is what makes it attractive.
Right.
Yes. Like I think to me, that's the thing. Like the fact that you're sacrificing,
and you can't turn it off logically. That's kind of my point.
Yes.
Like it's not that like you face it, you stack up all the evidence, and you're like, oh, well, now I'm going to reject that thing.
Right.
Sorry, I'll let you go. Yeah.
I do think Slavoj was quoting Christ, not Marx.
No, I know. Yeah.
But
that's funny. Yeah.
I think that's really right. That I just think that the illogic is the attraction. Like if you're sacrificing for something, then you're not really sacrificing, and you're not really enjoying it in the way that you do when you sacrifice for nothing. So I think that's really, that capitalism really gets at that. But then the main thing I think that it does is that it has this other face, which is the conscious face, which says, oh, I'm just pursuing my self-interest all the time. All that I'm doing is pursuing my self-interest. So to me, that is what I find fascinating, is that it has the one side that completely plays on the structure of our enjoyment and that we're unaware of. And then that is purely destructive, sacrifice for nothing. Yes. And then the other side, which is the exact opposite, which says all you're doing is pursuing your self-interest. And that's what makes this, that's Adam Smith, right? We all pursue our self-interest and everybody wins. So I think that to me, that coincidence of those two things is the crucial part of it.
If I can respond quickly, I wanted to say that that's a big part of what's in libidinal economy for Lyotard is, first, I mean, if you had to distill the book down into one phrase, it would be all political economy is libidinal economy. But to go to Todd's other point about the enjoyment of the suffering, one of the most famous passages from the book is describing the English steelworkers or miners or something of that. They had this attitude of hold me tight and spit on me, which is this effectively kind of making that same argument, is that it's the breaking down and it's the suffering of the work that they enjoy that. And that's how the system persists.
I think that's great. I mean, Ryan was right to describe, it's just the miners, it's the professor does it maybe more than anybody, right?
Yeah.
I think I'm as guilty of that as the next person, if not more than the next person.
and Lyotard has a scathing attack on, I guess, academic Marxists at the time. And he calls them kind of it's a whole polemic that I won't go into. Another thing that I found interesting in what Todd said and in the book too, is this notion of rational self-interest. You kind of described it, and I'm guessing this is probably kind of the Hegelian in Stirner and in kind of your studies, is that you're almost describing, there's a work called The Right to be Greedy, and it's by an anonymous group published in the 70s, but it kind of makes the same argument, is that capitalist self-interest is not real self-interest, in scare quotes, is not real enjoyment. If people were rationally enjoying rationally pursuing self-interest, then they would overthrow the system. It wouldn't be tenable. So,
but there wouldn't be enjoyment. That's the thing.
That's
like
the
rationally,
problem, right?
Yeah, like rationally pursuing. There's no enjoyment in rationally pursuing. So that's what drives the mainstream liberal thing like nuts. Like they don't get
exactly
the right wing. Like, how do you not see how we know how the market can work for you? Like, how do you not rationally? Not only does that suck philosophically, but it's also there's no enjoyment there either. And that's the pull that the right has that Todd is trying to, I think, in a lot of his more recent work is trying to tease that out and make that manifest in a way that I don't think it is in the general political discourse.
Right.
You know, if we just stick with Freud and this, I guess, to piggyback off what Todd was saying and Ryan, this notion that is it because Freud makes explicit that it's the constitutive failure, the self-sabotaging that you described, that is the compulsion to repeat, and it is about sort of missing the satisfaction, or it is that repetition of failure that actually in the end, you know, as you describe it, Freud does say at the end of the book that even if scientific speculation can't shed more light on this, there is something that the pleasure principle is sort of supporting or serving the death instincts. Could you say a little bit more on that, or maybe tie that in here?
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea that I think that these two sides, just to connect to capitalism, right? That this pleasure principle would be the pursuit of self-interest, and then that serves the underlying self-destructiveness. And I think it's interesting because you can think about a way in which you're just pursuing your self-interest. Ryan and I both love Coca-Cola. We think it's one of the great inventions in history, right? And so I'm just pursuing my self-interest in getting a Coke, right? It's pleasure. It's just pleasure in drinking it, but I'm also destroying myself, right? Like I'm like, it's one of the, I think people now are pretty sure like soft soda is one of the worst possible things you can consume. And so
also there's the most amount of plastic in the ocean is Coca-Cola bottles. It's
okay. That's a whole other way of
that's fractal ontology.
Right? So that destructiveness is, I think, what Freud's point is, that the pleasure that I'm getting from the drinking is actually serving that underlying self-destructiveness. And I think that's why I think the revolution, and Freud himself, the book is so great because you can see him trying to capture his own struggle with this concept. Wait, I can integrate this. A lot of people say, well, the Fort Da game, it's about mastery over. Well, no, because Freud's whole point is that doesn't explain. Mastery doesn't explain. Mastery is an attempt to explain this self-destruction through the pleasure principle, but it doesn't work in the end. And so I think and that's why Ryan, I think his points about the way the enjoyment works against all logic, all sense, that's really how it works. And I think that's what Freud's getting at. And I think he himself he didn't have time to really fully work it out because he died 18 years later, a long time. But I just think he didn't really come to grips with what that meant, that death drive, that self-destruction. And I think, to me, that once you see that as fundamental, then a lot follows. And then capitalism's effectiveness becomes clearer
right.
to me.
Just to reiterate the Marx quote you end the book with, I really appreciated, and I thought that consolidated, if it could be summed up in a citation or a reference.
Yeah.
You sort of trace the trajectory of this movement from volume 1 of Capital, which is from capitalism's own perspective on itself, to Marx, and it's funny because you do say that volume 2 is the drier of the trilogy, right? Which, obviously we don't have time for, but the quote is basically that capitalism would already have crumbled or be overthrown if I don't know if it'd be unconsciously or rationally. It wouldn't be rationally, obviously, but if we understood that enjoyment rather than enrichment was
what we're pursuing.
At stake.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
It's an amazing, it seems like he shouldn't have said that, right? Like it's just one of these moments where he
first liberal economist.
Right. He transcended himself. It really is, to me, one of the great moments. And I find that book almost boringly unreadable. Like it really is just, whereas volume 3 is amazing. So it's an interesting kind of down point, and then it comes back up. To me, that's Marx's greatest line. And I found myself, I quoted it in a couple of talks that I gave, and I'm like, I've got to save it for the one point in a book where because I can't quote it all the time, so that's where it came.
Very nice. I think that can wrap us up. And I just want to, give another heartfelt thank you to both Todd and Ryan for coming on the show and you've both been immensely generous over the years on coming on the show. So just a heartfelt thank you to both of you for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it's great.
And I hope that this whole insects within the jar situation was not unpleasant, let's say.
No, I feel pleasantly gnawed on. So
yeah, and Todd, Ryan, if we, in the future, in the next year or so, if we have you back, I really want to dig into your latest book on Hegel. I've heard nothing but good things. And it would be nice for us.
You're talking to the wrong people, Taylor.
Well, after we've, because we're gonna go into some Deleuze and do some more anti-Oedipus and stuff. But it would be nice to do some Hegel. And as I said, I haven't read it yet, but I've heard nothing but high praise for your book. The title of which escapes you. Remind me what it's called.
I think it's called Emancipation After Hegel.
That's right.
Achieving a Contradictory Revolution.
There you go.
Yeah, one of the highest praises I heard was that it goes even further than Marx in some of these revolutionary venues. So I know that might be, don't want to make you blush there, but
that's hyperbole, I think.
Hey, well, it's that's part of the fun.
If you want to see another side of Bob Dylan, another side of Slash and Burn McGowan come out, you have us on. You can talk about that book, but also Todd's position on a lot of contemporary Marxists. So that. Yeah, he's nodding his head.
Let's not do that.
All right.
Right.
Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you both. This is going to be Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins and the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour signing off for the week.
Of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is the murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.